Hey everybody, welcome to Accelerator, a sci-fi launch coaster which I'll be working on and showing off in this video. But before we get into that, I want to very quickly introduce it by saying what kind of very special occasion I am doing this for. Namely, from the 6th until the 10th of October there's going to be a party in the park of Planet Coaster, which means that anybody who owns a Thrill Seeker edition of the game is going to be able to actually open the early alpha, which is normally closed for this one weekend. And along with this, there are also going to be community streams on Saturday and Sunday from 6 to 9 PM in which the community managers will open a park made by the community and fill it with loads of stuff, among which actually some community creations in the form of Steam Workshop blueprints, and that is also what I'm making this coaster for. And if you're sitting right there at home and you're thinking I could also make some cool blueprints and send them over, you definitely can. There's going to be a link in the description of this video to the forum in which all of the party in the park information is stated, and that's all you really need to know. I think it's time to get into the coaster, so let's go. One thing I want to say about this coaster before we get into anything else is that it's made for a Steam Workshop blueprint submission, which means, among a couple of other things, that you'll be able to download it after it's all done, and I'll put a link down in the description so you can get it yourself. But for me, functionally, it also means that there are quite some limitations and boundaries which I usually don't really want to play around with. And one of them is that I'm limited to 1,000 pieces for this thing, and I won't go over it. The entire thing is going to be in the blueprint, and what you see is what you get. It just means that having just 1,000 pieces is quite a small limit to play around with, and it means that the theming is not going to be too over the top, and much of the focus here is actually on the coaster itself. And I really wanted to take this opportunity to focus a bit more on the coaster creator, whereas I usually focus a lot on scenery and making buildings and big themed areas. I am super crazy into coasters as well, and this was a great opportunity to actually focus on sort of getting my skills to be a bit better in the coaster editor and get used to it a bit more. So the type of coaster that I'm making here is a Gerstlauer Eurofighter, strictly speaking, but I wouldn't say that it's actually a Eurofighter in terms of the layout. It has the Eurofighter cars just because there's no other Gerstlauer coaster in the game, but it definitely won't have the vertical drop which is typical of a Eurofighter. I would say in general it's more inspired by launch coasters and infinity coasters by Gerstlauer, a bit of Karacho kind of elements. Anubis the ride, it's pretty similar to that as well, and just in general it's going to be a layout with two different launches and just a small but very fast-spaced and filled with all kinds of different elements, kind of compact Gerstlauer layouts. So the first half has that inclined tunnel launch, after which it just goes into a couple of inversions, and the very last part where I wanted to have a bit of airtime hills and some curves, it does lose a lot of speed, and I didn't really have much else to try at that point, but I wanted to get into the second launch and I wanted to keep them very close to each other. So the two launches are going to have tunnels around them, and they're going to be able to connect to the station so that we have one big dynamic piece of theming which is right in the middle of the ride, which makes sure that the sides of the coaster are also kind of empty, don't really have as much scenery, which in turn makes sure that it's quite a flexible coaster that you can just kind of use in many different ways. For example, just place the end of the ride over water or put it over paths, as long as you're not really doing too much with the center piece, which is going to be the station. The second part is quite similar to the first part. Really wanted to get that launch in there again to get a specific looking launch tunnel. It might not look like much at this point, but I kind of had an idea in my mind of what I wanted to do. It goes straight into an element which is very Incredible Hulk at Islands of Adventure-ish, straight into a zero-G roll with a curve, and a kind of Stengel Dive like element. I'm not sure if I would call it one. After which it just kind of helixes around and uses the little bit of remaining speed that it has to go through a barrel roll, which was actually one of my biggest challenges in here in general, but I'll get into that in a bit. And just comes around right at the end to go into the brake run, which has just a little bit of space left to actually have some block brakes, which means that we can have two cars on this thing, which makes it a bit more functional than just a coaster with one car, since the Eurofighter cars are very small. Now I'm already skipping ahead into the finished layout at this point. It's not completely finished, but Most of the work of the layout actually turned out to be a lot of smoothing and getting the hard lining right, and it's not as interesting as making the building, so I skipped ahead for a little bit. And you can actually see the tunnels on the side here. These were actually the tunnels that didn't make it to the final cut. I thought I was being super smart over here and made a couple of tunnels that are made out of coaster tracks. The rings around the tunnel there are the RMC coaster tracks, but apparently, and I should have definitely noted this before I went into the blueprint, you can't actually save multiple coasters within one blueprint, so that was very stupid. And I ended up having to replace the rings with some kind of scenery point later on. But first I wanted to do a bit of the station facade, which is not just functionally the station of this ride, but it's also by far the most recognizable and the biggest part of the scenery, so this is a really important thing. And I wanted to give this station a very futuristic kind of sci-fi theme to it, but also since I had to keep the amount of pieces very low and there is no sci-fi theme in the game as of yet, I also wanted to make it very minimalistic to kind of save on both points. And it has an almost kind of Art Deco little bit sort of influence in there as well. And if you've watched me for a very long time, you might actually recognize the style a little bit from my Roller Coaster Tycoon 3 coaster X-Surfer, which had a sort of similar style, just with very round shapes and much more curvy bits, and this is very straight and edgy and jagged. But the basic idea behind it remains the same. The station is not so much about the details, but really about the composition and the shapes of everything. And as you can tell, I just had a lot of fun playing around with the different kinds of elements and a lot of trial and error really to put in stuff and see how it kind of works. And if it works, just go on with the rest of the stuff. There was a little bit of like extra detailing that I wanted to get in just to make things a bit more interesting, like the small bars or things, little details on the side of walls or small lights, stuff like that. But in general, it's pretty low actually on the detail, and I wanted to keep it as simple and to the point as I could for many parts. Also, I know that the front of the building is very annoying right now since it's not entirely symmetrical with that roof, but that will be fixed in a minute, so don't worry about it too much. I quickly wanted to finish the rest of the station since the top part of the front facade is really going to be the most defining feature of the station and really gonna give it the shape that I was looking for. It has like a lot of different triangles going into each and every direction, and on top of the sort of entrance facade I wanted to get one big frame that would really finish the entire thing in a neat way, and I figured a white framework that really pops out from the much darker background just like that would work quite nicely for that goal and give it a nice sort of recognizable shape, because without it I felt like maybe the station building could turn into a whole heap of different little parts that all stick out from each other, but no part that really is like the big most defining feature. And that's really what I was looking for mostly with this thing, and I'm not going to be adding that kind of thing to the back of the station for some reason, also because it's quite tight there. There's a lot of coaster track and future tunnels to be worked around with, but also the back of the station is going to be a bit more low profile, even if it's still very similar and blending in with the front of the station as well. And these different parts on the side was just a lot more experimentation with messing with different shapes, kind of finishing everything in an interesting way and playing around with the different details. I eventually scrapped the ideas to have these similar white frames around all of the sides of the station. It just kind of felt like a bit of a too forced thing and something that was better left out. And eventually I just pretty much started filling in the gaps of the station that were still empty with all kinds of different colors and different materials, and that's pretty much how the rest plays out. And I want to get back to the coaster a little bit because I only kind of explained what the layout was like, but most of the time was actually spent off screen, like I've said before, about something which personally I'm still struggling with a lot since it's very hard to get done right in the coaster editor right now, which is the smoothing and the hard lining of the coaster. And if you're not that much into like coaster, the technical aspects or coaster enthusiasm, basically the hard lining is the fact that a coaster track doesn't actually revolve around its own axis, but actually the axis of the people that sit in the cars So for a barrel roll, for instance, the coaster track is not going to just flip 360 degrees, but it's going to actually rotate 360 degrees around a central point, which if you're sitting in the ride means if a ride is actually hard-lined, the inline twists and curves and all kinds of inversions are going to feel a lot more smooth than if there weren't any hardlining at all. The only problem is there is actually hardlining in the game, but the hardlining function and the smooth function actually cancel each other out, and they're both pretty much essential to actually build a smooth coaster. And a lot of the experimentation of this coaster was actually to get some manual hardlining in that is not only smooth, but actually revolves around the center axis as you're in the ride. And that's also why I wanted to get many of these different curves and inversions into the ride and play around with that kind of idea. And it's really what the ride in general revolves around. No pun intended, by the way. So that's really the sort of in-game technical aspects, and I also really felt like making a cool, interesting Gerstlauer just because they've been coming up with some really interesting coasters lately. And while there isn't any kind of launch coaster or infinity coaster in the game, I would kind of love to see them, but even if they don't make it, they're not the most common coasters at all. I still felt like it was a very interesting thing to try and something which I haven't really seen too much before. So yeah, that's really all about the coaster. It is quite a family coaster. It's not the most intense coaster ever, and it doesn't go too fast through the inversions. I don't imagine the forces being too bad either, but it's still, I feel like it's quite a fun coaster and manages to do quite a lot in the not so enormous footprint that it has, especially with the scenery around it. So that's really the philosophy behind the ride itself. Now back to the station, I wanted to finish the back as well. You are not able to actually save paths along with blueprints, so I made these walls and roofs that kind of show you where the paths of the entrance and the queue are supposed to be. Of course, if you get the blueprint and you have to lay down the paths, you can always ignore them. Feel free to do that kind of stuff, but this is basically the way that they're meant to be, and I wanted to lay out a quick guideline as to how you can do them. So if you download this thing and you want to open it in your own park, the only thing that you're still going to have to do yourself is actually lay down the entrance and the exit paths, which means for the entrance you're going to have to make the entire queue yourself. There is quite a lot of space left behind the ride to make a queue sort of wind between all of the supports and the track, but it is still something that you're going to have to play around with when you actually open the coaster. And now we're almost finished with the station here. I was struggling a little bit with the last part. Kind of had this open gap which looked a bit awkward compared to the rest of the ride, especially since these triangular parts are like such a defining feature of the station, especially on the front, and there's a lot of like simple squares on the back section here. I wanted to mess around with like some different, less predictable kind of elements here, and it took a while to actually do a lot of trial and error and come up with the right things. I eventually settled making that wall over there a triangle wall, which means that it is a bit offset and a bit annoying to work with if you look from the inside of the station. But from the outside I'm actually quite happy with how it works, especially with that pattern right there, just to make things a bit more interesting. And the rest of the front was just quickly finished with a bunch of different kind of things where I'm not really sure what they're supposed to be, but they kind of help make everything a bit more fancy. And I thought for a while that I could keep in these white pillars, but looking at the back of the station, which does have some black pillars and a lot of glass work, I really thought that I ought to have a bit more black pillars and black details, as well as a bit more glass on the back of the station as well. So I ended up adding a bit of this framework here, which was also a little bit tough to get right, since there isn't any piece which has like these pillars separately. There are black pillars, but they felt like just different than the thing that I was looking for. I was being super picky at this point, and ended up just covering the glass that I didn't need with some different elements, and I'm quite happy with how that turned out actually. Brings out the like the thing that comes out at the back a little bit more than the white pillars, I feel, since there's already quite a lot of white on this building in general. And I just put a lot of stuff on the ceiling just to make things more interesting. Maybe that was a bit of a waste of the 1,000 pieces, since with everything that I was doing at this point, I did have to keep in mind that I only have 1,000 pieces. So definitely had to be very careful with what kind of pieces I use and save them up quite a bit for the future. but there's just a few pieces on the ceiling counting the lights which are going to be added in the future, so I felt pretty safe about that. The biggest challenge actually to the entire piece problem was the gateway launch things, which means I wanted to get some rings around these things, and I wanted to get some sort of circular horizontal beams around these launches, and originally the plan was to make it out of coasters, which would have saved quite a few pieces, but with that plan out of the way, I had to make these connections between the things myself, and that ended up taking a lot of pieces, especially considering that these launch tunnels are pretty lengthy, and that I not only had to make one, but I had to copy it over to another place, which saves time for me, but it means that there's going to be a lot of different pieces in these launch tunnels. But in the end, I managed and got it just under 1,000 pieces, so that's not too big of an issue. Basically what I did is get in the horizontal beams, just to know wherever I needed to build things to connect them, and after that use some small roof pieces to actually connect the beams, get an almost kind of circular shape into the sides. It's not entirely perfect, but it does actually open up the sides for extra details, so I ended up putting lights on these white rings on the ends, which actually looks pretty fancy at night, and I'm pretty happy with how that turned out. And they do kind of have that Stargate sort of look to them. Fun fact, actually, these are originally supposed to be railguns, but I already had two projects before which are called railguns in Roller Coaster Tycoon 3, and to build a third coaster called railgun kind of felt a bit like I'm overdoing it, so I ended up not going with that name. But the design idea still really feels the same. You've got the station going on and two big gun tunnels coming out of it that launch the coaster into the different parts of the layout. It's a little bit Space Mountain as well. It's a little bit Incredible Hulk at Universal Islands of Adventure, and it's also a little bit crazy and over-the-top sci-fi, and that's really what I wanted to try here. Of course, I did have to support it a little bit at the end, since the in-game just track support would definitely not be able to hold up this weight, especially with all the very heavy rings around the coaster track. So I ended up placing a few extra supports made out of roof pieces around the ends of these tunnels, but that's really just about it. Everything else is kept pretty simple, and I wanted to move on to the next thing, which was decorating the area a little bit. I didn't want to add any foliage or anything around the ride, just to make sure that you can actually use it as flexibly as you want to in your parks. Be it just because you want to use it in any kind of park or in a sci-fi area, or because you're making a community stream as Frontier and you want to get community blueprints into the park. But what I did want to do is get a little bit of foliage in, just because it makes stuff look a lot better. And also the station was looking pretty boring at this point and didn't really connect too well to the area around it, so I figured it would be cool to add some round planters around the different sides of the station with a bunch of different bushes and trees in them, to decorate the area at least a little bit, and that's what I ended up doing. I definitely didn't want to overdo it though, since the very simplicity of the station and how well it kind of works without anything around it is something that I definitely wanted to keep here. But just a little bit of small foliage decoration felt like the right thing to place here, so that's why I ended up doing that for a bit. I did end up using a little bit of terraforming just to make the ground a little bit more grassy. It's not really a big thing, but I felt it would just make things look a bit more interesting when I would be taking pictures or this video. And after that, I wanted to move on to just about the last thing building-wise, which is a small building which doesn't really serve any kind of purpose. I suppose in real life this could just be the maintenance room for the launch tunnels, especially since there isn't much room in the station except for the room that is below the station. So this could definitely be used for the launch systems or electricity supplies, that kind of stuff. But also scenery wise, I wanted to fill this area in a little bit and connect something to the second launch gate as well. And that's what this building became quite useful for. And the launch gate also connects this building a little bit, at least visually, to the station as well. So I'm pretty happy about the way that that also kind of works together in a sense. And the launch gate itself I also had to keep pretty simple. Again, there are not too many pieces that I can play around with here, but I still wanted to make it quite recognizable. Ended up putting a couple of round pieces on the side here, just to make it a bit more recognizable than just a square gate. and that connects to this small building pretty neatly. Quite happy with how that turned out. And also a neat little trick was actually here to make separate walls inside of the small building here. And after the walls are placed, just separate those walls from the building so you can actually use the 3D gizmo to get a very precise placement of those walls to make the triangular decorations on the bottom of the building. And last but not least, a small detail that I wanted to add is a quick staircase or a catwalk on the side of the brake run. For safety reasons, but also it just makes the brake run look a little bit more fancy, a little bit more realistic as well, and it stays within the theme too. So that just seemed like an all-round win-win situation. Ended up making it pretty simply though, but I'm still quite happy with how that works out in the end. For many of these cases, by the way, I used some thicker grey-ish pillars for footers, which work out very well for any kind of pillar which you're making yourself. But actually, if you're making a coaster and the supports go into the ground or into the scenery or into the water and you can't actually see the footers anymore, I like to use those things as well, just as very simple replacement footers in case you still need a footer. And a couple of last very small foliage placements here on the side, just to make things again a bit more interesting. And that's the last thing that I did during daytime. Now the final thing in this time-lapse is going to be the lighting. It's pretty simple and straightforward, just lighting up most of the spaces which is still dark, but I also wanted to add some more decorative lighting. So there's the lights on the side of the launch tunnels, and there are going to be lights within the station itself as well. Anyway, that just about covers it for this time-lapse, and that's the entire making of this blueprint. Again, if you want to check out the blueprint, you can go to the Steam Workshop or check out the link in the description below. If you still want to get Planet Coaster Thrill Seeker Edition to play in Party in the Park, you can still do so, and if you want to submit some submissions for Party in the Park live streams, you can do so in the link in the description as well. That's all I have to say. Thank you guys for watching. I hope to see you guys next time, and enjoy the POV.
Sci-fi